Hello, and welcome to my presentation on emotional intelligence mapping. So, emotional intelligence refers to the ability to understand and manage one's own emotions effectively, and it has been studied for several decades now. Yet, it's commonly seen as something that you're either good at or not good at, and most people struggle to make sense of their own emotions, especially in a state of constant uncertainty around a global pandemic and all else going on in the world. People are experiencing a new set of emotions that they may not be familiar with and may have trouble navigating. That is why today I want to allow for the opportunity to explain emotional intelligence in a way that puts it into application in your lives and creates a sense of urgency to improve it. We will talk about its major component, self awareness, why it's of high importance to ourselves and our companies, and then create a clear map of how to get there. So we know from a young age the importance of having skills. We're sitting in sixth grade and we look around knowing exactly who the one is that's good at sports or good at writing, spelling, who's good at art. We know our peers, we know who's good at math, and so on. We tend to develop skills and expertise as individuals around a specific subject area or a hobby. It's far too common that crucial life skills get overlooked at this stage, and later in life we discover things like the art of listening, motivating others, leadership, and critical thinking. So emotional intelligence is a form of critical thinking inward, and it takes some people a very long time to uncover this as a skill and practice it. We all have emotional intelligence. It makes us human. We all have the unique human ability to understand ourselves and process our internal psychological subsystems. Whoa, right? Other animals can't do that. Plants surely can't do that. Nothing else can do that. I deeply believe that we all have this ability, but most of us aren't taught to practice it as much as soccer or academics growing up. Emotional intelligence, or EI, has been around for some time now, and many people have studied it and created frameworks. Here we have the EI model developed by researchers Goleman and Boyatzis. It has 4 quadrants explaining 4 facets or components involved in emotional intelligence. So it's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. A key skill for EI is improving your self-awareness, and I personally find it to be a really interesting topic. So that is what we're going to focus on. So how can we maintain the best and deepest self-awareness and be sure we are seeing the truth about ourselves? Researchers developed the Johari window model. This also displays 4 quadrants, but this time we're looking at it in the context of information about ourselves. So each quadrant signifies personal information, motivations, feelings, and whether that information is known or unknown to oneself and others. So I'll briefly explain each quadrant here. You'll see in blue the open arena. This is information that is known by ourselves and known by others. So it's just well-known information, the open arena. Next, to the right of that, we have our blind spot. So that's information that we don't know about ourselves, but other people can see. So obviously we can't see our blind spots, like when we're driving a car. Then below that, in green, we have the unknown. So this is information that's not known by ourselves nor by others. Nobody knows this. It's the total unknown. And then in yellow, we have information that is known by ourselves, but not known or seen by others. So this is our facade. These are the things that we might take for granted because we know about ourselves, but others don't know it. So what is the importance of studying all of this anyway? Most of us are actually not very self-aware. A study was conducted that proved 95% of people think that they're ranked high on self-awareness. Yet only 10 to 15% of those people were found to actually be self-aware. So, just because we are self-aware enough to believe we are very self-aware, it turns out we're actually unaware of how unself-aware we are. Did you get that? Kara McDuffie, an online blogger who gets really in depth into this stuff, says that self-awareness is our ability to recognize three elements: what we're feeling, thinking, and doing. So, what is in the way? What is the disconnect between perceived and actual self-awareness? Kara McDuffie made this cute little graphic that tells us it's not our fault. Our emotions and our biases stem from evolutionary tendencies dating back to ancient times. We also experience cultural norms and childhood coping mechanisms that lack emotional awareness or are in fact against it. For example, as a child, I was thankful enough to have my emotions encouraged, and my grandma told me that I was feeling things so deeply because I have a good heart. But I have some peers whose parents told them to check their emotions at the door and don't bring them into a space. Just bury them deep enough so that they don't come out, basically. Then we have research from 1990 by Solovey and Mayer that suggests that old cultural perceptions of emotions and emotional intelligence also play a role in our beliefs and behaviors. So some of the verbiage here says things like emotional intelligence is a contradiction. Emotions are disorganized interruptions of mental activity. They're so potentially disruptive that they must be controlled. And you must rule your feelings lest your feelings rule you. So that brings us to the business case for emotional intelligence. So how has EI in the role of self-awareness come from being a disorganized disruption or distraction to a total necessity and a value creator for a business? I want to pop this up here and point out, again, we're trained not to use our EI. At one point, we've stereotyped emotions to be nuisances that make us weak, irrational, and unprofessional, when really emotional capabilities are what make us strategically human. In looking at business research, the Capgemini Research Institute finds that EI as a business skill has increasing significance. 74% of executives and 58% of non-supervisory employees believe that EI will become a must-have skill in the next few years. Next, we're seeing that the age of artificial intelligence is shifting demand for skill sets in our talent pipelines. Demand for emotional intelligence as a skill is going to increase as much as 6 times. So displacement of routine tasks by AI is going to make EI a much more sought after skill because AI can't replace it. Do you see this? Like, our emotions are so valuable that people are trying to add this to AI machines, and they can't. It is so valuable. Finally, EI offers rewarding and transferable skills beyond just making you a more self-aware or empathetic employee. In practice, higher EI involves better flexible planning, creative thinking, redirected attention, and motivation. All of this, yet fewer than 1 in 5 companies train on EI. Can you imagine the potential business value and opportunities being missed out on? Now onto the personal case for EI, if the business or economic perspective wasn't convincing enough. The personal case is equally, if not way more important than the business case. Better EI means a more intentional way of living. Improving your EI benefits and enhances your relationships with yourself and others. Understanding others' perspectives fully will improve your interactions and relationships. In his course on social emotional intelligence, alongside of business professional Sherry Alexander, Jeffrey Sanchez Burks at the Ross School of Business said that if we can barely remember a previous perspective that we once had, like how it's hard to remember things when we were kids, how difficult is it to understand a perspective that we've never had, a perspective of someone else? It's hard. Next, a better EI means being more in touch with yourself, like we talked about with self-awareness. When you better understand yourself, your motivations, your roadblocks, you can feel more in control of your everyday life. So beyond these two benefits, there are endlessly more. Kara McDuffie highlights 5 more things that improved EI and self-awareness allows for: stronger relationships, improved happiness, as well as greater success in your life, better physical and emotional health, and more purposeful living. So, how exactly does this help your relationships with yourself and others? It's not a magic wand that we call EI. It's a deep understanding and intentional use of language. Think about it. How do you diagnose a physical illness without knowing the language for the illness or the symptoms? How do you diagnose an emotional state without knowing the language for the emotion or the feelings? We need to be able to accurately assess how we are feeling. Chris Jarrell leads a TED Talk on the importance of vocabulary or language when talking about emotions. So let's take a look on what he has to say.
The third thing was, I was hired by a pharmaceutical firm to come in and work with their senior R&D managers on the topic of emotional intelligence. And it's there that my story begins. Now, I'm sure a lot of you watch television and you're familiar with the Big Bang Theory and therefore the character of Sheldon. Imagine a whole room full of Sheldons. Guys, and they were all guys, who had been hired because of their intelligence, each of whom thought he was the brightest in the room. And then were promoted for those same skills, and now we're being moved into senior leadership. But the only problem is, at that level, you can't lead by being the brightest kid in the room. It actually comes across as abrasive and arrogant. But at the same time, I just couldn't walk in and start talking to them about emotions because it wasn't part of the equation that any one of them had ever learned. I was just a little bit upset and curious about where to start because most of these guys were what I would classify as emotionally binary. That is to say, if you asked them how they felt, they'd either say good or bad. So I was struggling with how to come up with a way to talk to them about emotions and the fact that perhaps frustration wasn't the same as anger, and that managing people in different emotional states was actually something that required different skills. And then one day I was having lunch with a friend of mine, and I noticed that she had a poster up on the wall of vegetables, only it was arranged in a periodic table like that thing that we had to remember in high school chemistry. And I thought, what if there was a periodic table of human emotions? Well, a quick search of the web found nothing, so I created one, and it looked like this. Now, relax, there's not a quiz at the end. But if I'd borrowed something as technical as Mendeleev's periodic table, it had better be as robust, or it and I would be thrown out. So you'll find things on it like the lighter emotions are towards the top, and the heavier and more complex emotions towards the bottom, with the radioactive sequences being replaced by passions and depressions, which are not only heavy and complex, but highly unstable. And it also progresses from the more visceral or gut emotions on the left towards the more lighter and heady and spiritual emotions on the right. And then to make it look more scientific, each emotion was given a chemical symbol and an atomic weight. And then I started playing with it to make it fun because after all, these are guys. And we have to play. So you'll find things in it that, that kind of reflect that. Like, for example, relief is expressed as a prescription. Pleasure was Love was given the weight of pi because love makes the world go round. And how about gratitude, 24/7? The heaviest of all the emotions was dread. It was given the estimated weight of the world, 6 times 10 to the 24th metric tons. Geek alert. Of course, denial doesn't believe it has any weight, so none was listed. And it was fun. It was fun getting them to see those things and having them work through that. And it accomplished my task of getting them involved in a conversation about emotions. But it's not emotional intelligence. At the end of the day, it was just an academic discussion. But I had to start there because, after all, these are guys. And forgive me for being politically incorrect, but 35 years on a men's team and doing a lot of men's work, and having written the Married Man's Survival Guide, I had a lot of information that we're not all that good at emotions. In fact, many of us have been taught not to feel. So you have to kind of start with the vocabulary first.
Brené Brown is another awesome researcher of this topic. 15 years ago, she collected survey data from 7,000 people and asked them to write a list of every emotion that you can recognize in yourself when you are feeling it and that you are able to name. The average number of emotions was 3: happy, mad, and sad. This world that we're living in definitely grants us way more emotions than just happy, mad, and sad. An example of this is how a lot of people like to use the words stressed or overwhelmed in these trying times with the pandemic. But in this book that she wrote, Atlas of the Heart, Brené provides more descriptive words than just saying that we're overwhelmed about everything. For example, we might be feeling frustrated. In the book, she labels and explains a whole 87 emotions because she believes that we need a vocabulary that is as expansive as the human experience. It's dangerous when we are not emotionally aware. This quote from Brené explains why. Language not only communicates emotion, it shapes actually what we're feeling. When the only words that we know are happy, mad, and sad, we tend to believe to be just those things. So to diversify your emotional language is to be more in touch with yourself and others, because you then fully understand the nuances of different emotional states. I have one more example here of the importance of emotional intelligence, and it involves the recent cultural event of Will Smith at the March 2022 Oscars. After Will Smith publicly slapped Chris Rock for comments made about his wife, he made an effort to publicly apologize on social media. It's actually a great example of some of the things that we're talking about here, as well as a model for how EI is important to remedy mistakes. First, he directly apologizes to Chris Rock about what has happened instead of ignoring or minimizing the situation. In his apology, he acknowledges the emotional hijack by saying, "I reacted emotionally." His emotional state got the best of him and caused him to take an action that he would later regret. Emotions have a lot of power over us. Finally, he demonstrates a deep understanding of himself and his emotions by the language he uses. The language, what we've been talking about. He says, "I'm embarrassed and my actions were not indicative of the man I want to be." This is exactly what we've been talking about here. Recognizing the unique emotional experience of embarrassment, as well as his use of language for the man he wants to be versus something like the man he is. Because many times in these circumstances, people will claim that their actions are not representative of who they are. In doing so, they sort of fail to address their weaknesses and they minimize what they've done. So this is just one unique example of how EI can better your life and your relationships. Now that we've discussed all the reasons for why EI is important, let's go ahead and create a clear map of how we can get there and be better versions of ourselves. Take some time and be intentional about recognizing emotions as they happen and what you might name those emotions. Think back to the periodic table that Chris Jarrell made and think about how your emotion might fit into that model. Read Brene Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart, and that will allow you to have some more names for the emotions you might be feeling. Next, ask other people for feedback and reflect on that feedback. Do you come across as emotionally intelligent? And if not, how can you possibly improve? Lastly, once you do the first two steps, by trying to recognize your emotions and asking others for feedback, acknowledge your gaps in skill and do your homework to fill those gaps. You can find many resources online that will help you name particular emotions and the ones that I just said, and this will help you understand yourself and others much better. Next, how can you improve your organization's collective EI? It all starts with building competencies within your talent. For example, an organization can incorporate EI into its training and development of employees. The L&D department could create customized programs for continuous EI skill development. Next, it's necessary to hire, promote, reward, and retain people based on EI or their learning potential for EI. Leadership in an organization has a direct influence on the culture of the work environment. So even if the L&D department, for example, is trying to implement continuous EI development programs, it is actually the leaders all across the organization who have direct influence on the extent that these programs are effective in helping actually increase the EI of employees. Finally, as the world of AI becomes exponentially better at performing routine tasks, work with artificial intelligence, and equip employees with the skills that they might need, considering the emerging need for emotional intelligence. And use technology to continually assess EI in the workforce too. Here's some final reasoning on a more serious note as to why EI is important as a larger society. As humans, we tend to be reactive, not reflective, and we have so many things going on that it's almost impossible to stop and think about these things and invest our time in building what makes us human. So Salovey and Mayer's research from 1990 says it best, and I'm going to read down the list here. People who don't learn to regulate their own emotions may become slaves to them. People who can't recognize emotions in others may be perceived as cloddish or oafish and ultimately be ostracized. People who cannot recognize emotion in themselves are therefore unable to plan lives that fulfill them emotionally. And finally, a society of such individuals could create a culture in which people are insufficiently rewarded and so regulate their emotions in alienating ways. Now, I don't know about you, but from my personal perspective, living on a college campus during the pandemic, this last quote hits to home a little bit. Sort of this idea that when we're not regulating our emotions and investing our time in building those, life gets very hectic in college and kind of live in an alienated culture. So this is just the final reasoning and sort of illustrates what happens when we don't invest in our emotions. With that, here are my citations for my research, and thank you so much for listening.